Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Billy sat on the cold hard bottom of the dimly lit storehouse, his wrists bound tightly with coarse rope, the rough filaments smelling into his skin as he plotted to free himself, his heart forging with the admixture of fear, wrathfulness and unbelief. Just hours agone, he'd allowed. He could trust Sally that her fidelity had been unwavering, but now, as he watched her standing a many bases down with Cain by her side, the treason cut deeper than any physical restraint ever could, a cutter ringing in his casket as he realized that she wasn't the same woman he'd known. Her eyes, generally filled with warmth and mischief, were now cold, calculating and strangely distant, and the way she changed ganders with Cain made it sorrowfully clear that this was further than a simple alliance. It was a precisely orchestrated plan. One in which Billy was simply a pawn, a piece to be manipulated and moved on their mysterious chessboard. Sally's lips twisted into a small, nearly inappreciable smile, a cruel shadow of the charm she had formerly applied painlessly, and Billy's mind contended with questions that had no immediate answers. Why would she do this? What did Cain gain from this cooperation? And most importantly, was there any part of Sally still pious to him, or had she fully abandoned the bonds of fellowship, trust, and maybe indeed love that had formerly tied them together? He tried to speak, to call out to her, to reach whatever humanity remained in her, but the monkey shine Cain had forced into his mouth muffled his cries, turning them into strangled, pointless sounds that sounded to regale her further than anything differently, and he felt a swell of helplessness marshland over him, hanging to overwhelm the wrathfulness that had been stewing in his casket. Meanwhile, Cain leaned casually against a jalopy, percolating a calm, nearly trim air that varied starkly with the pressure in the room, his arms crossed as he surveyed the scene, as if he'd been staying for this exact moment, savoring the control he now held over a situation that had formerly been far too chaotic for his taste. He'd always been strategic, always calculating, and this plan with Sally, whatever its wind-up, had easily been in the workshop far longer than Billy had ever imagined. Memories of the day's events flashed through Billy's mind. The phone calls that sounded inoffensive at first, the meetings that Cain had concurrently arranged, Sally's defenses that had sounded genuine at the time, and now, each of those moments took on a minatory new meaning, pieces of a mystification that revealed just how deeply he'd been deceived. And yet, amidst the fear, the treason and the confusion, a spark of defiance burned in him. He'd not let this master him, he'd find a way out of this trap, he'd uncover the verity behind Cain and Sally's plan, and he'd make sure that whoever had conspired against him paid for undervaluing him. The air in the storehouse was thick, rough, filled with the subtle hum of distant ministry and the occasional drip of water echoing from the murk, and each second that passed sounded to stretch endlessly, amplifying the suspension and giving Cain and Sally further power, further time to savor the moment. Yet Billy's mind worked frenetically, conniving, assessing, flashing back every detail of the storehouse, every jalopy, every implicit armament he could reach, every escape route he could exploit. Sally, seeing his eyes on her, lifted her head slightly, the faintest trace of vacillation fluttering across her features before it was gone, replaced formerly again by the icy mask of someone committed to her part in Cain's scheme, and Billy wondered if that vacillation was a crack in her armor, a thread he could pull at to unravel everything. He flashed back the times they had laughed together, the secrets they had participated, the plans they had made to support each other against the Newman-Forrester conflicts, and he realized that the treason wasn't just about whatever Cain's mysterious plan was. It was particular, it was intimate, and it was ruinous, and it fueled a storm of feelings in him that he slightly managed to contain. The pressure in the room was nearly unsupportable, a tense line ready to snap, and as Cain stepped closer, his shadow brewing over Billy, a cold calculated grin spreading across his face, Billy felt the weight of his situation pressing down on him, but he also felt a swell of determination, a clarity that came from the consummation that surviving this, exposing the verity, and defying Sally and Cain in the open would be the ultimate reckoning, and that reckoning would not be enough, and it would not be commodity they could fluently escape, because Billy Abbott, despite being tied, despite being betrayed, had no way been one to back down, and he'd spent enough of his life proving that he could survive anything, no matter how dark, how crooked or how particular the schemes against him came. And in that moment, as Sally and Cain began brooding in low tones about their coming move, Billy began working on a plan of his own, one that needed tolerance, observation, and cunning, but one that promised that when the time came, he'd turn the tables in a way neither of them could anticipate, because treason might shake him, it might hurt him, but it would no way break him, and the storm that was erecting in his mind imaged the storm of feelings in his heart: rage, despair, determination, and the burning desire for verity and justice that had defined him throughout the chaos of Genoa City. And as he awaited, biding his time, quietly strategizing every possible move, he knew that the story of this night was far from over, and that the consequences of Sally's treason and Kane's mysterious plan were only just beginning to unfold, and that the megacity of Genoa itself might fluctuate when the secrets they were hiding came to light, because in the end, nothing stayed retired ever, and Billy Abbott, though bound, though betrayed, would rise, and the reckoning would be spectacular. Billy plodded against the ropes, his hands raw and paining, his muscles pulsing as he tried to pull free, but the coarse filaments cut into his wrists with every movement, a constant memorial that he was at the mercy of two people he'd formerly trusted, two people whose grins had formerly felt like sun and whose presence had been a source of comfort but now were nothing further than instruments of his suffering, instruments applied by Sally and Kane, whose alliance was both confusing and intimidating because he couldn't understand why she'd side with Kane, why she'd choose a mysterious plan over their fellowship, their history, over everything that had tied them together in the history. And as he watched her spare casually against a jalopy, the dim light catching in her hair, giving her a nearly ethereal gleam that varied cruelly with the dispassionateness in her eyes, he realized that she was no longer the woman he'd known, no longer the person who had participated. Secrets, horselaugh, and dreams with him in moments when life in Genoa City felt inviting and insolvable, and yet, deep outside, a small flicker of the woman he flashed back remained, a hint of warmth and vacillation that betrayed itself in the nearly inappreciable vacillation before she jounced to Kane, signaling that their plan was moving forward, and it was this flicker, small and fragile, that gave Billy a thread of stopgap, a fragile lifeline that he cleaved to desperately as his mind contended through possibilities for escape, for redemption, for vengeance, for understanding, because if there was one thing he knew about Genoa City, it was that nothing stayed buried ever, that secrets always came to light, and that treason, no matter how cruel, could be turned into an occasion if one had the tolerance and the cunning to seize it. And Billy Abbott, despite being bound, despite being gagged, despite the despair that hovered to overwhelm him, had spent his entire life learning to survive, to fight, and to outthink indeed the most advised adversaries, and he'd not let this night, this treason, define him, because the story was far from over, and the consequences of Sally's conduct and Kane's mysterious plan were only just beginning to take shape. He could hear them brooding to each other in low tones, their words designedly muffled by the distance and the murk, but the meter, the urgency, the subtle pressure in their voices told him further than any factual words could, signaling that whatever they were planning, it was bigger than he'd imagined, more dangerous than he'd stressed, and conceivably more particular than he was prepared to handle, and yet amidst the fear, the confusion, and the eating pain of treason, a fire burned in him, a combination of wrathfulness, determination, and clarity that stoned his senses and made him apprehensive of every detail in the storehouse, the heaps of beaters that could serve as influence, the murk that might hide escape routes, the distant hum of ministry that could mask the sounds of his movements, and the faint glint of essence in the corner that could potentially be turned into a tool, a armament, or a key to freedom. And as his mind contended, formulating a plan that balanced tolerance with action, strategy with instinct, he realized that the key to survival lay not in brute force but in timing, observation, and the capability to read the lowest signs of weakness in his opponents, because Sally and Kane, for all their apparent control, were mortal, and humans, no matter how clever, always made miscalculations, and every second he spent set and observing brought him closer to the moment when those miscalculations would give him an opening, and he'd take it. Sally shifted slightly, brushing a beachfront of hair from her face, and Kane's eyes followed her every move with a nearly raptorial perfection, a subtle boo playing on his lips as if he could formally fantasize the success of whatever plan they were executing, and the sight of them together, aligned against him, sparked a admixture of despair and strategic thinking in Billy, because he knew that emotional responses would only make him vulnerable, would only feed the sense of control they were trying to assert, and that the only way to survive, the only way to fight back, was to detach just enough to suppose easily, to plan, to calculate, to stay for the right moment when the balance of power could shift, Because in Genoa City, power was no way stationary, fidelity was always negotiable, and treason, while ruinous, could always be abused if one was clever enough to see the openings hidden within it. Time sounded to stretch endlessly as he sat, paralyzed, forced to watch the two people who had been closest to him execute moves he couldn't completely comprehend yet, and the pressure in the room thickened with every passing second, as if the veritably air were apprehensive of the storm that was erecting, a storm that combined fear, rage, expectation, and the raw energy of a reckoning that was ineluctable because secrets, especially Bones, involving Sally, Kane, and the Abbott family were no way meant to remain retired, and Billy knew deep in his gut that the coming hours would test him, would push him to the edge of what he could endure, and yet, paradoxically, it was this veritably pressure, this gauntlet of treason and peril, that stoned his resoluteness, that made his mind clearer, that reminded him that he wasn't a victim, that he'd survived every twist, every treason, every battle in Genoa City's Machiavellian world, and that this, no matter how dire, was just another challenge, another mystification, another scene in the complex, dangerous, and dramatic story that was his life. He flashed back their participated history, the horse laugh, the arguments, the late-night addresses, the moments of connection that had formerly defined his relationship with Sally, and the discrepancy between that history and the present moment fueled both his wrathfulness and his determination, because love, fellowship, and trust, formerly broken, left scars, but those scars also left assignments, and he'd learned enough about mortal jest, about deception, about strategy, and about timing to know that tolerance was as important as courage, that observation was as critical as action, and that indeed the lowest vacillation or misstep by Kane or Sally could be turned to his advantage, a armament in the internal game they were playing, indeed if the physical conditions sounded absolute. As Sally and Kane continued to confer, Billy's mind contended through the possibilities, imagining issues ranging from escape to battle to uncovering the full extent of their mysterious plan, to turning their own scheme against them, and with each script, he mentally rehearsed every action, every word, every move, icing that when the moment came, he'd act decisively because vacillation, or reliance on luck alone would guarantee failure. And Billy Abbott had no way. Reckoned on luck. He reckoned on skill, knowledge, instincts, and the capability to turn adversity into advantage, a particularity honed through times of surviving the manipulations, dishonors, and power struggles of Genoa City. Kane eventually stepped closer, his shadow stretching over Billy like a dark curtain, and Billy felt the full weight of the trouble he posed, the peril expiring. From a man who had always thrived on control, strategy, and calculated pitfalls, and yet, despite Kane's imposing presence, despite the ropes cutting into his skin, despite the treason that soaked sharper than any physical pain, Billy felt a swell of clarity, a sense that the power dynamic, while presently against him, was far from endless because Kane, for all his cunning, was still a man with sins, habits, and predictable patterns, and Billy had spent enough of his life observing people like him to know how to exploit them, to know when to stay, when to act, and when to strike with perfection and force, and he could feel the gears of his mind turning, spinning, planning, calculating, preparing for the moment when the tables would turn. Sally's voice broke through the pressure, soft yet firm, intimating at instructions, details of the plan, the coming way, and for the first time, Billy noticed a subtle apprehension in her tone, a earthquake that suggested mistrustfulness, vacillation, or guilt, and his palpitation quickened, because this was a crack in their armor, an opening that he could exploit if he remained patient, calm, and observant, and he began quietly rehearsing his approach, imagining the sequence of events that would allow him to influence this mistrustfulness, to manipulate the situation, to produce chaos in a controlled way that would ultimately free him and expose the verity behind whatever plot Kane and Sally were making, a plot whose details remained obscure but whose consequences were formerly resonating through the room, through the storehouse, through his mind, and through the fragile trust that had formerly was between him and Sally. He reflected on the once backstabbings, the moments of manipulation he'd endured at the hands of the Newman family, the Forrester conflicts, the colluding, the alliances, the secrets, the falsehoods, the near misses, the competitions, and the times he'd been undervalued, dismissed, or undervalued again, and he realized that every single bone of those jests had been medication for this moment, that every failure, every heartache, every near tragedy had trained him, honed his instincts, stoned his mind, and strengthened his resoluteness, and now, facing the treason of someone he'd trusted implicitly and the plots of a man who thrived on control and secretiveness, he felt the capstone of times of survival instincts, strategy, and raw determination coalescing into a single, potent force, a readiness to turn the situation to his advantage, to bide his time, to strike with perfection, and to crop from this night not just unbroken but victorious, because Billy Abbott wasn't a man who could be truly restrained by ropes, betrayed by musketeers, or bullied by pitfalls. He was a man who thrived under pressure, who learned from adversity, who planned in silence, and who, when the moment was right, acted with implacable focus and courage. The storehouse sounded to palpitate with pressure, the murk heightening as the twinkles stretched, the quiet hum of distant machines marking the passage of time like a preamble to ineluctable battle, and Billy's senses were hyper-aware. The subtle shift in Sally's posture, the movement of Kane's hand, the faint creak of a jalopy as if motioning an implicit tool or handicap, the faint scent of oil painting and dust, the distant echo of steps that might belong to someone entering or leaving the space, every detail adding to the internal chart he was constructing, a chart of occasion, threat, and timing, a chart that would allow him to seize control of the situation, unravel Kane and Sally's plan, and ensure that the backstabbings he'd suffered didn't go unanswered, because in Genoa City, the price of treason was no way ignored, and the consequences, formerly unleashed, were frequently disastrous, and Billy Abbott, indeed bound and betrayed, had formerly begun calculating the storm he'd unleash when the moment was right, the reckoning that would not just free him but expose every secret, every taradiddle, every hidden docket, and ensure that the megacity itself witnessed the full scale of the consequences, because nothing remained retired ever, and the night, thick with pressure and deception, was only the morning of a reckoning that would shake foundations, test commitment, and ever alter the connections, alliances, and power dynamics in the intricate, dangerous, and endlessly dramatic world of Genoa City. Billy's mind raced as he weighed every possible outcome, every potential misstep, every slight hesitation he could exploit, and even as his wrists throbbed and his body ached from the restraints, a strange clarity settled over him, a cold, focused awareness that allowed him to see the warehouse not as a trap but as a stage, a game board where every crate, shadow, and beam of light could be leveraged, where every sound, every footstep, every whispered word could be a signal, a clue, a crack in the carefully constructed facade that Kane and Sally were presenting, and as he listened to them speak in hushed tones, trying to decipher their plan from the rhythm and cadence of their words, he began to piece together a mental map of their intentions, imagining what they might do next, calculating how long it would take for Kane to make a move, for Sally to betray her own conscience if given the right nudge, and he realized that even the smallest opportunity, the tiniest lapse in their coordination, could be enough to shift the power entirely in his favor, because he had learned that in Genoa City, victory rarely came from brute strength alone. It came from patience, cunning, and the ability to see the unseen, to predict the unpredictable, and to act decisively when the moment arrived, and he had spent enough of his life surviving the unpredictable chaos of the city to know that this moment, while terrifying, was also an opportunity. He forced himself to breathe slowly, deliberately, focusing on the slight tremor in Sally's hands, the subtle narrowing of Kane's eyes as he considered the next step, the uneven rhythm of their footsteps across the cold concrete floor. And each of these minute details became threads of a plan that Billy could pull, small leverage points that, if used carefully, could unravel the entire scheme, and as the minutes ticked by, he found himself mentally rehearsing every scenario. What if he feigned weakness? What if he provoked Kane? What if he appealed to Sally's lingering conscience? What if he created a distraction using the crates, the loose tools, the rope itself? And in each scenario, he saw the way they might react, the openings he could exploit, the momentum he could gain, and the ultimate outcome he sought: freedom, revelation, and retribution. Billy's chest tightened as he thought of the betrayal itself, the sting of Sally's alignment with Kane, the cold calculation that had replaced the warmth he once trusted, but he forced himself to transform that anger into fuel, into strategic focus, because despair would only give Kane and Sally the upper hand, and he knew he could not afford that, not now, not ever, because the consequences of inaction were too high, and the stakes were not merely personal. They were about justice, exposure, and the intricate web of secrets and lies that had always defined life in Genoa City, a city where alliances shifted like sand and where one misstep could destroy everything, and Billy Abbott, bound, betrayed, and tested, had no intention of letting that happen on his watch, because he had survived worse, had endured more, and had always emerged stronger, smarter, and more determined, and he would do so again this time, with Sally and Kane as the catalysts for a reckoning that they could not possibly imagine.